What if dressing wasn't just a matter of taste or trend, but also an act of affirmation, defiance, and love? What if a simple scarf could be a poetical act? And what if a color, a cut, or an accessory became a sign of recognition, a declaration of love, or a gesture of resistance? Welcome to my Fashion Stories Box podcast. I am Catherine, and in this episode, I invite you to delve into the history of queer codes in fashion. From clothes worn in secret to looks proudly worn, from New York ballrooms to Parisian catwalks, we will explore how style can become a language, a refuge, a cry from freedom. Because while fashion can sometimes confine, it has also allowed entire generations to express themselves, to find themselves, to resist. From the origins of the queer movement to its appropriation by fashion, today I invite you to dive into the themes of gender identity and transgressions. Because in queer fashion, nothing is left to chance. Not an handkerchief in the back pocket, not a pair of boots, not a crop top. Everything has a meaning, everything is a sign, everything is a story. And let's listen to them. Before examining the use of clothing in queer culture, let's take a few moments to define this queer culture and trace its origins. Queer culture refers to the set of practices, values, codes, modes of artistic expression, and forms of sociability developed by and for people who do not identify with traditional norms of gender and sexuality. It is part of an approach that challenges binary categories, man, woman, straight, gay, and heteronormative and cisnormative models. Originally, the word queer meant strange or weird in English and was long used as an insult towards homosexual people or those whose gender expression did not conform to social norms, particularly since the late 19th century. It was only in the 1980s and 1990s that the term was reappropriated by LGBTQ+ communities as a symbol of affirmation and resistance to stigma. The queer movement emerged in the United States at the end of the 1980s, in a context where gay and lesbian identity politics dominated LGBT struggles. The AIDS epidemic and internal debates around the boundaries of identity, gender orientation, race, and class pushed for a rethinking of traditional categories. Queer theory draws inspiration from post-structuralist and deconstructivist thought, notably that of Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida. Intellectuals such as Judith Butler, Eve Kosofsky-Zegwitz, Gloria Anzaldúa, and Teresa de Lauretis played a central role in formalizing queer thought. This theory challenges the idea that gender and sexuality are natural givens and asserts that they are socially and historically constructed. From the beginning, queer culture was driven by activists who fought against oppression and exclusion, claiming the legitimacy of all gender and sexual identities. The movement emphasized the right to be different, the critique of dominant forms, and the creation of spaces where everyone could express themselves freely. To sum it up, the characteristics of queer culture are the following. Queer culture values the fluidity of identities, the ambiguity and the diversity of gender and sexual expressions. It encourages people to think outside the box and question the dominant relationships related to gender and sexuality. It manifests itself through events such as marches, parties, ball culture, drag shows, artistic productions, dress codes, and languages specific to the community. Queer culture is characterized by the reappropriation of previously stigmatized symbols, words, and practices, transforming them into tools of affirmation and resistance. Being queer also means criticizing social norms, demanding diversity, and fighting for recognition and equal rights. Queer culture is therefore plural and evolving. It brings together people with varied identities and backgrounds, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, trans, non-binary, intersex, and so on, and is enriched by intersections with other struggles such as anti-racism, feminism, and so on. The queer movement is often associated with Pride Month and the large parades that takes place at the end of June. Let's take a closer look at its origins. The origins of Pride Month date back to the Stonewall riots, which occurred on the night of June 27-28, 1969, in New York City. At that time, the LGBTQ+ community was facing severe police and social repression, and raids on gay bars were frequent. During the raid in the Stonewall Inn, a bar in the Greenwich Village neighborhood, those present, including trans and people of color, refused to give in, triggering several days of clashes with the police. In tribute to these riots, the first commemorative march, called Christopher Street Liberation Day, was organized in New York in June 1970 and later in other major American cities. This marked the beginning of the Pride Marches, or Gay Pride, which gradually became an annual and international event celebrated mainly in June to commemorate Stonewall. The month of June was therefore chosen to commemorate these founding events and celebrate the visibility, pride, and demands for the rights of LGBTQ+ people. Over time, this gathering expanded to cover the entire month, becoming Pride Month. But before being celebrated on runway shows and parades, queer fashion was first written in the background, in the unspoken, the diversions, the appearance chosen to survive or attract the attention of the right audience. The queer movement has historically used clothing as a tool of camouflage and secret communication to navigate hostile environments while remaining recognizable to other members of the community. Camouflaged clothing allowed queer people to blend into mainstream society, to avoid persecution or stigmatization, while remaining visible to other insiders. This strategy consisted of adopting a neutral appearance or one that conformed to social expectations, but with subtle details that served as signals to those who knew how to interpret them. Certain clothing practices have become veritable secret codes. The most emblematic example is the hanky code, which emerged in the gay community in the 1970s. It consists of wearing a specific colored handkerchief in the back pocket of one's pants or elsewhere to indicate one's sexual preferences, roles, or interests. The color of the handkerchief and the side of which it is worn, left or right, communicate specific information to those in the know, while remaining unintelligible to the uninitiated people. Another example is the mixing of traditionally masculine and feminine clothing, or the use of coded elements such as flowers, colors, jewelry worn in a certain way, which allows one to signal a queer identity or belonging to the community without explicitly expressing it. Some accessories have a coded language, such as the green flower, worn in the lapel, notably by Oscar Wilde and its contemporaries. It was a sign of homosexual recognition in the late 19th century. The red tie is another symbol used in certain cycles to indicate affiliation or sympathy with the LGBTQ+ cause. Wearing many keys on the belt was a lesbian code in the 1970s and 1980s. The violet is another flower which was associated with lesbian and queer culture, particularly in reference to Sappho and ancient Greece. We'll come back to that a bit later. In addition to this visual language, we must also take into consideration the use of certain words, expressions, cultural references, or attitudes that, for those in the know, signal queer belonging or sympathy. This is what we call queer coding. Communication through innuendo, winks, or behaviors recognizable by the community. If you know, you know. But the codes don't stop at cuts. There are also colors. Pink, for example, once a masculine shade in the post-war period, became a stigma imposed on homosexual men in Nazi camps before being proudly reclaimed as a symbol of identity and struggle. Queer codes vary across eras, cultures, and subcommunities. They can relate to fashion, accessories, speech patterns, or even gestures and postures. Historically, they served as a means of recognition and protection in hostile societies. Today, they also serve to assert identity, to create connections, and celebrate diversity within the queer community. More broadly, queer fashion involves transcending gender norms through clothing, creating an aesthetic that can be both an act of political visibility and a means of internal communication within that community. This use of clothing, therefore, has a dual function. A protective function to shield oneself from hostile glances by remaining discreet or ambiguous, and a recognition function to enable encounters, solidarity, and communication between queer people through coded signs. But talking about queer culture also involves talking about the survival strategies that are put in place. One of these is passing. Passing plays a complex and ambivalent role in queer culture, particularly for trans and non-binary people. It refers to a person's ability to be perceived by society as belonging to the gender with which they identify, often without their trans identity or difference being visible. For many trans or LGBTIQ people, passing, that is to say, being perceived as their desired gender or orientation without their difference being visible, can be a matter of survival, particularly in hostile contexts or when accessing housing, work, or public spaces. Being assimilated to the cisgender or heterosexual norm often allows them to avoid discrimination, harassment, or violence. Passing facilitates integration into social, professional, or administrative spaces where conformity to gender or orientation norms is expected. The more a person conforms to dominant norms, the more readily they will be accepted into privileged social groups, which can often access to opportunities and rights that might otherwise be denied. Being recognized in one's gender identity or orientation without question promotes self-esteem and a sense of belonging. It can also help avoid situations of unwanted outing or intrusion into one's privacy. However, it will be reductive to think that the gender transgressions at the origin of queer culture are the preserve of our modern society. They are much older, as we will see together. Thus, the first gender transgressions date back to antiquity and are attested in many civilizations around the world. From the earliest writings of Mesopotamia, we find traces of people living under a gender other than that of their birth, and similar accounts exist on all continents. In Greco-Roman antiquity, people known as hermaphrodites or androgynes were perceived as transgressions of the established sexual order, although often stigmatized or marginalized. In ancient Greece, a highly patriarchal society, one figure stands out: Sappho, a Greek poetess from the 7th century before Christ. Although her case is more a matter of transgressing sexual norms than gender norms, she is a major figure in queer history. In ancient Rome, for example, the emperor Heliogabalus asked to be referred to as feminine and expressed a desire to access a double sexual nature. Figures transgressing gender forms also appear in traditional societies such as the Irjas in South Asia, who occupied specific ritual roles before European colonization. In medieval and early modern Europe, cross-dressing was sometimes tolerated, particularly for women wishing to enter professions or positions that were forbidden to them, as soldiers, knights, or monks, while paths toward the feminine were more harshly punished. Two famous cases are documented as early as the 14th century, such as a certain Roland in Venice in 1355 or a certain Eleanor in London in 1394, both arrested for adopting a gender expression different from that expected. A very emblematic figure of this gender cross-dressing is Joan of Arc, who wore male armor and clothing to lead the French troops during the 100 Years' War. This was one of the grounds for a trial, as her cross-dressing was associated with religious heresy and led to her being burned alive in 1431. They weren't joking at that time. From the Renaissance through the 18th century, wearing clothing associated with the opposite sex was tolerated, particularly for women wishing to pass as men in order to travel, to work, or to join the military. The 18th century and the 19th century offer some examples of gender transgressions, ranging from cross-dressing for professional or survival reasons to the public affirmation of a different gender identity despite repression and social stigma. In the 18th century, libertine women, the ancestors of courtesans, defied traditional roles, actively participating in changing the social, moral, and sexual norms of their time. They abandoned traditional feminine dress, simplified their attire, and sometimes adopted more comfortable or masculine-inspired clothing, symbolizing their desire to escape the unpleasant slavery of social norms. The 18th century also saw the emergence of women who acquired greater intellectual power. They held salons, they wrote, they debated, and participated in literary and philosophical life, taking over traditionally masculine spaces. Some, as in the book Danger Liaisons, used the weapon of seduction, manipulation, and wit to compete with men. Faced with the dominant libertine imagination where women are often reduced to prey, some libertine women offer a counter-model. They take charge of their own education, claim their right to pleasure and autonomy, and participate in the construction of new narratives on femininity and sexuality. Some women, like Mademoiselle de Ville, used their sexual freedom and skill to ensure financial independence, accumulating a fortune that allowed them to escape male tutelage. Another 18th century figure is the Chevalier d'Éon. A French diplomat, spy, and soldier, the Chevalier d'Éon lived part of his life as a man and another as a woman, publicly asserting his feminine identity from 1777. His life has sparked fascination and debate around gender fluidity at the French court and in England. And the first woman to circumnavigate the globe, Jeanne Barrett, disguised herself as a man to embark as a botanist assistant on Bougainville's expedition between 1766 and 1769. A transgression of gender norms allowed her to access space reserved for men without arousing the suspicion of her fellow travelers. Very interesting. The 19th century saw the persistence of cross-dressing, often associated with prostitution or criminality, in legal records. Women who wore men's clothing could be suspected of wanting to access forbidden spaces or professions, or of hiding their identity for reasons of safety or autonomy. As for during the antiquity, the so-called hermaphrodites or androgynous people were also perceived as transgressing the established sexual order. And of course, their existence disrupted the binary vision of the sexes, and they were often stigmatized, even persecuted. 19th century Gothic novels frequently featured female characters who defied traditional gender roles, embodying a form of social and moral transgression. These literary figures contributed to the challenge of the gender norms of the time. Dandies, courtesans, and Georges Sand or other figures who, through their appearance, lifestyle, or work, challenged traditional gender roles and paved the way for reflection on identity, freedom, and difference in the 19th century society, which was a very conservative one. Dandyism is a form of revolt against 19th century social and bourgeois norms. Through his cult of elegance, originality, and difference, the dandy thought to assert himself outside of conventions, including those related to gender. His elaborate, sometimes androgynous appearance, including the wearing of a corset, muscular silhouette, and provocative attitude, challenged traditional masculinity and social conformity. The dandy asserted his singularity as a tool of ultimate negation of the bourgeois, materialistic, and conformist world, which included a challenge to dominant gender models. 19th century courtesans, although operating in a highly codified world, freed themselves from traditional female roles through their financial autonomy, sexual freedom, and influence in artistic and political cycles. They transgressed the norm of the submissive and domestic woman, gaining access to a form of power and visibility denied to the majority of women of their time. Their lifestyle, their independence, and their ability to appropriate masculine codes, managing their wealth and controlling their image, made them figures of subversion of gender roles. George Sand, whose real name was Amandine Aurore Dupin, was an emblematic figure of the transgression of gender norms in the 19th century. She adopted a male pseudonym, wore men's clothing in Paris, which allowed her to move around freely and access spaces forbidden to women, and claimed a freedom of morals and thought that was exceptional for a woman of her time. Through her life choices, her literary work, and her commitment, George Sand embodied an active challenge to gender assignments and campaigned for the emancipation of women. A symbol of the 1920s and the post-First World War society, flappers or garçons adopted traditionally masculine clothing and hairstyle, short hair, trousers, suits, blurring the line between masculine and feminine and challenging sexual differentiation through clothing. They demanded autonomy, freedom of movement, the practice of sports, driving, frequenting public spaces, sexual freedom, extramarital affairs, open homosexuality or bisexuality, all behaviors then reserved for men or considered scandalous for women. The flapper embodied the modern woman freed from social and moral constraints and became a figure who disrupted the social and sexual order, arousing fascination and rejection in the society of the time. The flapper doesn't just imitate men, she invents a new femininity, both androgynous and sensual, which subverts traditional expectations about gender and sexuality. The flapper phenomenon is part of a movement for female emancipation and demands for gender equality, prefiguring contemporary womanhood. In the 20th century, simple gestures like smoking a cigar for a woman were still considered gender transgressions until the 1970s and 1990s. Beyond attire and associated codes, so-called queer spaces play also a central role in queer culture, both in building communities and in preserving memory, artistic creation, and political struggle. Historically, bars and clubs like the Stonewall Inn in New York or the Village in Paris have been spaces of resistance, socialization, and political organization. In London, the Soho district, with establishments like the Admiral Duncan pub and the Royal Vauxhall Tavern, has been an epicenter of LGBTQ+ life since the 17th century, hosting performances, drag shows, and activist events. Bookstores and cultural centers such as Gaze the World bookstore in London, founded in 1979, have become institutions where the community can gather, learn, and debate. Qtopia Sydney, a museum and cultural center, offers exhibitions on queer history, the AIDS crisis, human rights, and media representation. Other museums and exhibition spaces, such as Tate Britain and the Museum of London, highlight LGBTQ+ artists and history, contributing to the recognition and promotion of queer culture. And of course, festivals and other events, such as the Gay Pride and Queerwashing, organized in London, Berlin, Amsterdam, and so on, or the BFI Flair, London's International LGBTQ+ Film Festival, bring together transnational audiences around creativity, activism, and celebration. These spaces are important because they offer refuge from social hostility, allowing queer people to express themselves, to meet and to exist without fear of judgment or violence. They act as a vehicle for transmitting queer memory and history by preserving and retelling long-silenced stories, thus contributing to the construction of a collective memory and the visibility of LGBTQ+ struggles and achievements. They are also laboratories of creativity where new codes, artistic expressions, and forms of sociability specific to queer culture are born. Many of these spaces serve as bases for organizing social movements, campaigns, and political actions, playing a key role in advancing LGBTQ+ rights. Clandestine balls, New York clubs, Parisian salons, boudoirs, and costume balls are all spaces that allowed people to experiment with identity through clothing, to dare and to exist. Dressing to camouflage oneself, yes, but also to assert oneself. Queer culture has invented, celebrated, and transformed clothing like few other communities. Now closely linked to the queer imagination, the origins of voguing, ballroom culture, and drag queens are in turn linked to the history of the African American and Latina LGBTQ+ communities in the United States, primarily in New York City. The first drag balls date back to at least the late 19th century, with the Hamilton Lodge Ball in Harlem as early as 1869, where LGBTQ+ people gathered in costumes to parade and compete. These events, initially dominated by white participants, gradually saw the emergence of Black and Latino participation, although the latter were often discriminated against during competitions. Faced with racial discrimination, figures like Crystal LaBeija created their own system of balls and houses in the 1970s, through chosen families offering support and protection to young people rejected by their biological families. The first house of LaBeija Ball in 1972 marked a turning point, laying the foundations of modern ballroom culture. The American series Pose, released in 2018 and temporarily available on Netflix, explores the world of the ballroom scene, voguing, and the New York LGBT community in the late 1980s, with the threat of AIDS hanging over it. Watch it, it's my recommendation. Voguing, on the other hand, originated in Harlem ballrooms in the early 20th century, but truly exploded in the 1980s as a signature dance style. Inspired by the poses of models in fashion magazines, particularly Vogue, hence its name, voguing became a competition of stylized gestures, physical performance, and creativity. Voguing was propelled into the international scene by Madonna with her music video Vogue in 1990, followed by the 1991 documentary Paris is Burning, which documented the life of the houses and the importance of this culture for queer people of color. As for drag queens, they have been present since the first balls of the 19th century, where they competed in female impersonations and created spectacular performances. A drag queen is a person, usually a man, who embodies a female character on stage or at events in a spectacular, extravagant, and theatrical manner. This performance relies on the exaggeration of codes, archetypes, and stereotypes of femininity. Elaborate makeup, flashy outfits, sophisticated hairstyles, and accentuated gestures and postures. Drag queens perform in a variety of settings: cabarets, nightclubs, competitions, pride marches, or lip-syncing, singing, dancing, or comedy shows. While historically most drag queens were gay men, today anyone, regardless of gender or sexual orientation, can practice this art. The goal is as much entertainment as it is subversion or the celebration of diversity, with the drag queen often playing an iconic role in queer and LGBTQ plus culture. Drag competitions are becoming a mainstay of ballrooms with varied categories as costume, attitude, realness, and so on. While the drag scene exists in diverse environments, ballroom culture gives it a strong community, political, and artistic dimension, particularly among trans and racialized people who find in these spaces a place of expression, recognition, and resistance. Ballrooms and houses became refuges from racism, homophobia, and transphobia, offering surrogate families and spaces for creativity, solidarity, and struggle. Voguing, ballroom culture, and drag queens have profoundly influenced contemporary queer fashion, music, dance, and aesthetics, while remaining symbols of resistance and identity affirmation. The appropriation of elements from the opposite wardrobe, whether suits, tuxedos, dresses, or accessories, has been a central driving force of queer and gender-fluid fashion since the 20th century and continues to shape contemporary fashion by challenging the gender binary. The already mentioned flapper girl of the 1920s adopted short hair, trousers, skirts, shirts, and suits, blurring the lines between masculine and feminine and embodying a new freedom. Also in the 1920s, New York, drag balls allowed gay men and trans people to perform in flamboyant feminine outfits away from moralizing gazes. Again, still in the 1920s, Coco Chanel introduced the blazer, traditionally masculine, into the women's wardrobe, as did a strap-down suits, helping to masculinize the female silhouette. In the 1930s and 1940s, Marlene Dietrich regularly wore men's suits, hats, and ties, becoming an icon of queer and bisexual fashion. Elsa Schiaparelli borrowed trouser suits from men, offering women a practical and modern alternative to the dress. And in 1969, Yves Saint Laurent's launch of the women's tuxedo marked a turning point. It offered women a garment emblematic of masculinity, allowing them to appropriate the power and elegance traditionally reserved for men. From the end of the 19th century, women began wearing trousers, notably with the advent of the blue jeans. This garment, a symbol of the masculine world, gradually became a tool of emancipation for women, despite persistent bans until the 1970s. Men's clothing, such as the tank top or the perfecto jacket, was appropriated by gay culture and then reinvested in mainstream fashion, blurring the codes of virility. Popularized by Jacques Esterel in the 1960s and later by Jean-Paul Gaultier, the men's skirt remains a bold proposition, still marginal in contemporary men's wardrobe. Since the 1990s and the 2000s, designers like Jean-Paul Gaultier and a new generation with Ludovic de Saint-Cernin, Telfar Clemens, Christopher John Rogers, and so on, have deliberately blurred the lines of gender on the catwalks, offering collections where dresses, skirts, suits, and accessories are worn indiscriminately by all genders. And what about Jonathan Anderson's first Spring-Summer 2026 show for Dior Men, shown during the last Paris Fashion Week in June 2025, which took the concepts of the new look and the flower woman and applied them to trousers? Artists like Harry Styles, Pedro Pascal, and Billie Eilish publicly play with the dress codes of the opposite gender: dresses, skirts, pearls, and nail polish for some, baggy clothes, tracksuits, and masculine coats for others, popularizing androgyny and queer fashion among the general public. The club and drag scene, such as the eccentric look of the New York's Club Kids, the glamour of drag queen like RuPaul, and the aesthetic of voguing, including heels, sequins, outrageous makeup, inspire contemporary haute couture. Clothing, therefore, constitutes a powerful tool for asserting identity and aesthetics in queer culture, particularly through practices such as gender fucking, uniform repurposing, and pride looks. Gender fucking involves deliberately mixing, blurring, or subverting the dress codes associated with masculine and feminine genders, creating androgynous or ambiguous appearances. This practice aims to challenge gender binary, assert a non-conforming identity, and the freedom of individual expression. For example, wearing traditionally masculine and feminine elements simultaneously, a dress with military boots, makeup over a beard, a suit with a tie and heels, or playing with cuts, materials, and accessories to create an unclassifiable look. The diversion of uniforms as military, police workers, sailors, school, or religious is common in queer and LGBT fashion. It involves appropriating symbols of authority, virility, or oppression to transform them into signs of affirmation, desire, or subversion. The sailor vest or sweater, the leather cap, the perfecto, or even military uniforms, hijacked by gay and queer culture since the 1970s and 1980s, have become emblems of resistance and visibility. This misappropriation often aims to turn their own symbols against homophobic groups, to play with the eroticization of virile codes, or to create an aesthetic of power and irony. I don't know about you, but it makes me think of the band The Village People and their song YMCA. Legend has it that in the late 1970s, two French producers, Jacques Morali and Henri Bellolo, passing by a boys' hostel in New York called YMCA, had the idea for a slightly ambiguous song about boys sleeping together. And they would have met an Indian in a part of New York called The Village, hence the name of the band, then a man wearing cowboy hat in a bar in the same neighborhood, known for being the haunt of misfits of all kinds, to which were added a construction worker with a hard hat, a uniformed police officer, also a soldier, a biker. In short, the gay community in America, but also around the world, quickly recognized itself in this male cliché, and the band found its audience. Finally, the looks worn during pride marches are often spectacular, colorful, exuberant, and deliberately non-conformist. They serve as both a celebration of diversity and a political statement. The characteristics of these looks are a mix of genres, sequins, rainbow flags, slogans on clothings, the subversion of stereotypes as drag queens, feathers, latex, sheer, sequined leather outfits, revisited uniforms, and the affirmation of bodily freedom and the right to visibility. These looks create a collective aesthetic, foster recognition among community members, and publicly display pride in oneself. Fashion designers have understood the potential. Artists and designers have integrated queer, androgynous, and non-binary elements into their performances and collections, popularizing queer aesthetics globally. Leading queer designers stand out for their creativity, their commitment to diversity, and the ability to challenge gender norms in fashion. Yves Saint Laurent, along with Pierre Berger, introduced the tuxedo for women in the 1960s, and an androgynous aesthetic that has left his mark on fashion history. Jean-Paul Gaultier, nicknamed Enfant Terrible of fashion, revolutionized fashion with his androgynous creations, men's skirts, inclusive castings, and constant tributes to queer culture, as a runway show featuring Conchita Wurst as the bride. Alexander McQueen, known for his subversive runway shows, often drew on the queer imagination, gender fluidity, and artistic provocation. But also Giorgio Armani, Gianni Versace, Dolce & Gabbana, Marc Jacobs, John Galliano, Thierry Mugler, Karl Lagerfeld, Azedine Alaya, Dries Van Noten, Pierre Balmain, Christian Dior, who often openly gay or allied, have profoundly influenced fashion by integrating queer elements and blurring the boundaries of gender. Closer to us, we could add the following names as Harris Reed, a non-binary designer known for his dramatic, fluid silhouettes. He embraces an unabashedly queer style and advocates for inclusivity. Telfar Clemens, founder of Telfar, advocates for accessible, inclusive, and community-based fashion with the slogan, "It's not for you, it's for everyone." Another name would be Woody Shawaria, an openly gay Latino designer blending political activism, street culture, and sophisticated tailoring. My Leggett, for official rebrand, offers gender-neutral upcycled clothing with a punk and environmentalist approach. Ashish Gupta, a British designer of Indian origin, is known for his provocative collections and explicit political messages in support of the queer community. Simon Porte-Jacquemus, an openly gay French designer, includes in his collections inspiration from popular culture, working class, and queer aesthetics. Fashion houses as Balenciaga and Vêtements regularly explore queer codes and gender deconstruction, particularly in their casting and stylistic choices. And finally, Comme des Garçons, which is a pioneering brand in the exploration of androgyny and nonconformity. So, the adoption of clothing traditionally associated with the other gender, women's tuxedos, men's skirts, suits on women, dresses on men, short haircuts for women, and the use of makeup and accessories without distinction of gender or at the heart of queer fashion. The repurposing of uniforms, military, police, and sailors as examples and symbols of authority, as well as the integration of BDSM or fetish elements such as leather, harnesses, and chains, are strong markers of queer culture today, often echoed in haute couture. Queer fashion favors personal expression, creativity, and boldness, with colorful clothing, exuberant patterns, unconventional cuts, and great freedom in the assembly of pieces. And what about the queer icons who have left their mark on fashion? These are figures who have made their mark on history with their bold style, their break with gender norms, and their influence on queer culture and fashion. They come from diverse backgrounds. They can be artists, designers, historical figures, or contemporary ones. Amongst them, we can find Oscar Wilde, the Chevalier d'Éon, and Joan of Arc, as we saw earlier, but also Frida Kahlo, a Mexican artist known for androgynous style, her self-portraits, and her embrace of bisexuality. Josephine Baker, a 20th century French-American artist and a queer icon for commitment and style. Jean Cocteau, a French poet, filmmaker, and artist whose aesthetic and personal life inspired the queer culture. Not to forget David Bowie, a singer and performer and pioneer of androgyny and queer looks in pop culture. Of course, Madonna, pop artist, muse of the LGBTQ+ community, and famous for transgressive looks and support for queer rights. Of course, Lady Gaga, singer and performer, queer icon for her extravagant looks and activism. Billy Porter, an actor and singer known for his spectacular gender-bending red carpet looks. And RuPaul, a drag queen and host of the RuPaul's Drag Race, who is a major figure in drag and queer visibility. Let's not forget the Sister Queen, a drag queen group, and last but not least, Gladys Bentley, a 1920s blues singer known for masculine costumes and outspoken homosexuality. And on this list, I could also have added Colette. Today, brands want to be inclusive. Catwalks want to be non-binary. And every June windows are adorned with rainbows. Queer heritage is increasingly visible and sells. Luxury fashion houses are reclaiming queer codes by blurring the lines between genders and promoting diversity on the catwalks and in their campaigns. But they are often criticized for their lack of real commitment and the commercial exploitation of queer symbols, particularly during Pride Month. New practices are being used to capitalize on the popularity of queer culture, such as queerwashing and rainbow capitalism, which are a bit the equivalents of greenwashing for fast fashion, and are opportunistic marketing strategies where companies, institutions, or brands display apparent support for the LGBTQIA+ community, primarily for commercial gain, without real or deep commitment to the rights or well-being of this community. Queerwashing occurs when a company or organization highlights LGBTQIA+ issues in its communications or advertising campaigns, but without any concrete commitment or tangible actions in support of the community. For example, using LGBTQIA+ symbols such as rainbow flag, inclusive slogans during Pride Month, or in advertisements when the company does not actually support LGBTQIA+ rights, with a lack of inclusive internet policies, donations to associations, and so on. Rainbow capitalism, also known as rainbow washing, refers to the commercial use of LGBTQIA+ symbols and activisms to increase sales or brand image without any real social or political commitment. For example, marketing rainbow-colored products during Pride Month, repainting crosswalks without taking concrete measures to combat violence against queer people, or launching inclusive advertising campaigns without actively supporting the community. This strategy allows companies to project a progressive and tolerant image, and both are increasingly criticized by activists for their superficiality and opportunism. But behind the commercial reclamation and return of queer codes to the mainstream, sometimes without references to their history and context, we must not forget the history, the struggles, the years of silence, oppressions, and clandestine creativity. Educating ourselves, informing ourselves, challenging this appropriation, and highlighting and supporting young queer creators are all actions that each of us can take. More and more young queer designers are asserting their identity without compromise. They use quotes inherited from the past, gay biker leather, 80s crop tops, harnesses, bodycon silhouettes, to write a new grammar of style. These young non-binary designers are driving stylistic innovations and challenging gender norms in fashion, art, and culture. Their approach is a continuation of queer struggles while bringing new perspectives on identity, fluidity, and plurality. Their increased presence in media, runway shows, exhibitions, and cultural spaces contributes to a better representation of non-binary identities and the deconstructions of traditional binary models. Drawing inspiration from queer archives and stories from the past, these designers are reinventing quotes, drawing on activist legacies, and proposing new forms of expression, thus participating in the living transmission of queer culture. Indeed, queer transmission and archives are fundamental to the vitality, memory, and innovation of queer culture. They are essentials for preserving, making visible, and enriching the collective LGBTQIA+ memory. They fuel the inspiration and commitment to young non-binary creators who in turn actively participate in the evolution, recognition, and dissemination of queer culture. Queer culture, long marginalized or invisible, relies on the transmission of minority stories, practices, and knowledge. This transmission helps preserve the history of struggles, resistance, artistic creations, and individual lives, often absent from official narratives. Faced with the lack of written or official archives, oral history plays a key role. Collecting the testimonies of queer people helps preserve lived experiences and give a voice to those who have been erased or ignored by dominant history. Intergenerational transmission is essential for younger generations to appropriate a culture, references, and tools of resistance while avoiding isolation and the loss of collective memory. queer archives as archive centers, specialized libraries, collaborative platforms like Queer Code or the Big Data Network make LGBTQIA+ journeys, works, and struggles visible, offering a valuable resource for research, education, and identity building. It is therefore important to acknowledge the history and struggles behind styles and not to stop at the aesthetic aspect and the fashion factor. Queer fashion is not just a trend. It is a territory of expression. It is a space of freedom, play, transgression. It is a mirror of societies, their progresses, but also their tensions. From the first instances of cross-dressing to Harlem voguing balls, from coded headscarves to the masculine skirts of fashion weeks, queer fashion has always been where we least expected it. It has blurred lines, questioned norms, and reversed roles. So the next time you come across a slightly off-bet silhouette, an exuberant style, or an unlikely combination, ask yourself, what if it was a message? A story, a claim. Because in the great wardrobe of humanity, queer people have seen threads of pride, memory, and revolution. Behind each piece worn proudly often lies a silent struggle, a restorative pride, a story to tell. Thank you for listening to this episode of my Fashion Stories Box podcast. Find the Box of Time Queer Edition on Instagram to explore references, styles, and symbols. If you have any reading recommendations, queer profiles, or queer designers, please share them by commenting on this episode. And as always, subscribe, comment, like, and share. I am Catherine, and you've just listened to another episode of my Fashion Stories Box podcast, a podcast about stories in fashion history. See you soon for a new journey through fashion's fabulous history.